5, 4, 3, 2, 1, 0. All engine running.
In 1977, Cuba had a close alliance with the Soviet Union, which kept many Caribbean nations wary. When Cuban fishing boats of questionable intent encroached on the Dominican Republic's territorial waters and near its shores, they were buzzed by P-51 Mustangs of the Dominican Air Force. Although classic fighters from World War II, the Mustangs were hopelessly outclassed as fighters by 1977. Eventually, one of the Cuban ships, the Capitan Teo, encroached on the shoreline, so the Dominican Navy confiscated it. The crew was accused of espionage, and the ship was taken to Puerto Plata harbor. Fidel Castro decided to retaliate with a military response called Operation Pico. On September 8, 1977, Castro convened his staff and had Colonel Rafael de Pina plan and later lead the mission. Operation Pico called for the deploying of 12 MiG-21 fighters from the air base at San Antonio de Cuba. Although Fidel's brother Raul Castro signed off on the plan, Fidel personally saw to the preparations. He wanted to keep the Russians from being involved, so he had all Russian Cyrillic markings removed from both the aircraft and the external fuel tanks. The Cuban Missile Crisis had been just 15 years earlier, and Castro was well aware of the dangers of accidentally implicating the Russians. To help prevent trouble, the decision was made that the MiGs were to be unarmed. The next morning, many Cuban jets took off from many airfields in many directions all over the island to help the Operation Pico aircraft to get lost in the crowd. The 12 Operation Pico fighters took off and headed eastward towards the Dominican Republic. Other units flew different missions around the island, and Castro even mobilized the army along the eastern Cuban coastline. All of this served as a distraction to the American forces at Guantanamo and obscured the real mission of the Operation Pico MiGs. Although Castro's motives were aimed at the Dominicans, he also relished the opportunity to conduct the operation right under the noses of the Americans. He had once called American President Jimmy Carter an idiota venedor de mani, or idiot peanut peddler, and he had little fear that the American president would respond with anything stronger than words. Following a refueling stop at the Cuban air base near Guantanamo, the 12 MiGs slipped past the American forces. They avoided Haitian airspace to prevent any collateral international incidents. For this reason, they also dropped their auxiliary tanks in the ocean off the coast of Puerto Plata as opposed to overland once the fuel in them was expended. Moments later, they descended to the deck and broke the sound barrier. Reports claim that jets came in so low over Santo Domingo that their supersonic boom knocked out windows. Several times the 12 jets buzzed the capital, but of course without firing any weapons. The Dominican Air Force did nothing as interception was essentially impossible. Some reports indicate that a few Mustangs did take off, but if they did, they probably reached Santo Domingan airspace long after the MiGs had departed for home. Shortly thereafter, all 12 MiGs returned safely to Cuba, where Fidel personally congratulated the pilots. At first, it appeared that Phase 1 of Operation Pico, the scare tactic, seemed to have worked. But hours passed, and by that evening there was still no reaction from the Dominican government of President Balaguer. Castro had given them an ultimatum: return the ship in 24 hours or he would launch attacks against Santo Domingo, Puerto Plata, and Santiago. There were only a few more hours to go, and Cuban spies inside the Dominican government had not sent any information to Castro that indicated Dominican capitulation. Fidel had backed himself into a political corner and now had no other choice other than to order Phase 2 if his regime was to maintain credibility. Preparations for the bombardment were initiated, but this did not set well with many Cubans, including senior officers, who saw the Dominicans as fellow Caribbean Latinos. Early on the morning of September 10, 1977, Cuban ground crews began loading the MiGs with Russian-made 500-pound bombs. The pilots were briefed on the targets, and since these bombs were extremely powerful and collateral damage could be high, the targets were changed from Army and Marine facilities near the city to the San Ysidro Air Force Base well east of Santo Domingo. It would be less likely to cause civilian deaths, and they would probably destroy the Dominican P-51 Mustang fleet on the ground. By 8:30 local time, the planes were loaded and the crews ready, but just over an hour before the ultimatum ran out, the long-awaited message, "Barco devuelto," the ship has been returned, was received by the Cubans. The Cuban pilots were relieved that they would not have to bomb their Dominican neighbors. Not long afterwards, some of the MiG's drop tanks were found washed up on shore near Puerto Plata. With all Russian markings removed. While the Dominican Republic did not see much more action in relation to the Cold War after this incident, some of the 12 Cuban pilots of Operation Pico did. Some died in operations in Ethiopia and Angola. Colonel Rafael de Pino, who planned and personally flew the mission, defected to the United States in 1987. His memoirs provide much of what is known about the details of the mission. Other pilots rose in rank and are or were high-ranking officials within the current Cuban Air Force. This incident is mostly forgotten now by most Dominicans, but the U.S. still has classified intelligence on the event concerning details that, amongst other things, explain why the ships were out there to begin with. Were they simply a couple of Cuban fishing boats that got caught up in Cold War paranoia, or were they actually on a spying mission? Officially, publicly, to this date, we still do not know.